While curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
Consider this. When you're nervous, where do you feel it in your body? Right in the gut. Your brain, nervous system and gut are intrinsically connected. What is happening in your nervous system affects your gut, and what is happening in your gut affects your brain. You could be eating the perfect diet and working out 5 days a week, but if you don't address your mind and nervous system function, then you are really missing a big piece of the picture. You met Angela Peiffer earlier in the series. She's a nutritionist from Seattle, Washington, with a specialty in gut health. I asked her what the number one thing linked to gut issues was.
Stress. It would be stress, honestly.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the health journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? In season 1 of The Shift, we explore the fascinating field of gut health and help you discover what is really going on with your digestion, microbiome and health.
The gut is amazing.
Changes our concept of the human body. Become useless to the healthcare system.
We're always shifting. Your genes are shifting, your microbes are shifting, everything is shifting.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift. In the last episode of The Shift, we spoke about the many links that your gut has to the rest of your body. In this episode, we're going to deep dive on a very important one, the gut-brain connection.
We all are eating on the go, running with our hair on fire, not getting enough sleep, staring at our blue screen all day long, and any moment that we might have any break to actually breathe, we got to check email. We got to check our screen. We got to look up a news thing. We got to watch a video. I mean, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So honestly, I think stress is a big one. And I'd say too, stress is all encompassing. I mean, my goodness, the conversation we could have just around that in terms of our environment and the impact. And part of it is everything that we're getting loaded with. And part of it is that none of us get to unload.
I've long talked about stress because A, it's one of the challenges that we all face, but B, it's personal for me as well, and I'm always looking at ways of managing it better.
Here's Katherine Maslen, Doctor of Chinese Medicine.
There was a period of time where stress was glorified, and I know that I definitely felt like I was more effective when I was stressed, and that if I wasn't stressed, then I didn't look like to the world that I was doing enough. I now know that that's ridiculous and that less is more, but I think it's a conscious choice, and I think that even though we might think we're not stressed, stress is so much more than just being under pressure or having to pick the kids up from school by a certain time. Stress is how well is your gut functioning? What is your liver doing? What do you think about every morning when you wake up? Do you look in the mirror and go, you look awful? Is your handbag, car and house an absolute shambles? That's stressful. There's so many things that add to the stress pile. So we have to get conscious, and it's a habit. I say to patients, I need you to be aware of what you're stressed about. I need you to start to ask yourself the question, does this warrant stress? In this moment, I feel really overwhelmed. Does it warrant stress? Because the chances are it's no. And we've got to learn to take a step back and just assess a little bit better. Like in the moment where we feel like we're going to fly off the handle, could you maybe just try it on as an experiment, take a step back and ask yourself, hang on, do I really need to worry about this? Probably not. There's very small everyday fixes that I think that we need to be aware of that are so appropriate for us to be doing that can change the overall landscape of our health, yet we're just not doing it.
Some good food for thought here from Katherine Maslen. Sometimes we only think of stress as things like facing deadlines or having too much on our plate. But what about all the little things that take us out of calm and put us into stress every day? Stress doesn't just affect our mental state, it has a heap of physiological effects in the body too. Stress can impair our digestive function in a number of ways. For example, when we're stressed, the acid-producing pumps in our stomachs can stop producing acid, which leads to low stomach acid and a heap of the symptoms we discussed in episode 4, including bloating, indigestion, burping and wind. When we're in flight or fight, sometimes known as flight or freeze, we cannot be in the opposite of that, which is feeding and fornicating, which means digestion and reproduction. Flight or fight is a survival mechanism that humans have built in to help them survive dangerous situations. When we're put in a dangerous situation, like for instance a saber-toothed tiger wanting to eat you, our bodies jump into flight or fight to help us to survive. In this state, most of the energy, blood and nutrients are directed into your muscles and brain so that you can decide to run or fight. While we're not often in danger of getting eaten anymore, we do suffer from being in a low-grade flight or fight state that has all kinds of health detriments. Summer Bock broke this down really well.
Stress hormones released by the body put you in a state of fight or flight or freeze. And when you are in that mode, your digestion slows down, essentially, because the blood moves away and goes into your limbs and goes to more important things like, heart and lungs so that you can run or do whatever you need to do to survive. It's a survival mode. Digestion is not the most important thing. Digestion is what you do when you're safe and when you're calm. The rest of the time, you're trying to get your food and you need to be able to run and do whatever you need to do. So we live in a culture today where people are in a chronic state of flight or freeze. And not only are they in that state perpetually, they are also addicted to it and they take substances to maintain that state. So drinking coffee on a regular basis, multiple times a day, nicotine, all of these other substances that are just people are so addicted to keep them functional, productive, part of society. It's really unfortunate, but those are major factors in destroying the gut because all of a sudden the gut can't actually function as well as it needs to. It doesn't have the blood, right? But it's also going to be moving slower. And I call hormones text messages. And so, our cells use hormones to text message back and forth to each other. But bacteria are cells, yeasts are cells too. And so all these organisms in the microbiome actually read these text messages that say that the body is stressed and they respond in like. So they know what to do in a stressed environment and they grow differently. It causes certain bacteria to grow out of balance that shouldn't and can hamper the growth of some important bacteria.
While you're probably aware that taking antibiotics can damage your microbiome, the concept of stress doing the same may be new to you. It's quite a big concern, considering that we take antibiotics from time to time, but a lot of us are stressed constantly. Charlotte Watts is a UK yoga instructor, nutritionist, and the author of 3 books, including The De-Stress Effect and Good Mood Food. This made her the perfect person to ask about the effects of chronic stress on our gut.
Chronic stress affects the microbiome. There's plenty of good research to show that it reduces numbers of colonizing gut bacteria. It's an interesting part of working out how our gut bacteria are letting our whole body know if we're safe or unsafe. So if you go through a stressful event, it's important to register that you are unsafe and you need to keep up a stress response. You need to keep in survival self-protective mode. So if you go through a period of stress and your gut bacteria is lowered, then your organism is kind of like, okay, well, that's lowered, therefore I must stay in the stress response. So it's also shown that when our levels of gut bacteria are lowered, our tendency to react to stress is heightened. So that's how your brain talks to your adrenals. You get the input at the brain, and then your reactivity at the adrenals will kind of govern how high your reactivity is in terms of fight or flight. So when levels of beneficial gut bacteria are low, we are more reactive. So you get this kind of chicken and egg happen, that if you go through a period of chronic stress, if you don't have the requisite recovery period, rest, looking after your gut, then you don't have the opportunity to come down the other side again. It's chronic, unrelenting stress when we have no sense of control, no recovery, no rest, no sense of safe, that then wears down, and it wears down the microbiome. It really compromises how we digest food.
Do you think people realise that they're stressed?
No. And that's actually because the definition of stress is really skewed. People think that often that stress means anxiety, or it means they can't handle things, or that they're overwhelmed. And yes, it is related to those things. But in and of itself, stress isn't a judgment. But I think to recognise if you are feeling overwhelmed, if you're not sleeping properly, if you're not digesting properly, if you feel anxious, if you're not having the quality of life that means spending really, quality of time with your family, your friends, if we don't have that sense of expanse, openness, connection in life, then that's to be examined. Not to criticise what we're doing wrong, but to go, actually, do I have quality of life?
So the gist of it is, when we're stressed, it damages our microbiome. Our microbes can then stay in a stress response as a result of their lowered numbers. This can impair our ability to cope with stress, which can then lead to a vicious cycle where we're chronically stressed with a chronically depleted microbiome. I'd like to start a conversation now about how your emotions can cause stress in your physical body. I gave the example earlier of how when we're nervous, we get butterflies in our tummy. So we know that our emotional state can impact our physical bodies. Christine Hassler is the author and one of the world's leaders in the emotional wellness space. I asked her how emotions can cause stress in the physical body.
Well, they can do it in a variety of ways, and it depends on how people relate to their emotions. A lot of times, emotions can feel very overwhelming to people, and so their response is, I just got to be busy. Busy, 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 busy. And so that's just going to wear down the body. It's going to make you less mindful of what you eat, and it's going to create stress on the body that way. Other people that emotions are just too big, they may go for a numbing device. And for some people, it's just like, I don't want to feel anything. I'm just going to shut down. I'm just going to become very cerebral, very in my head, disconnect from my body. Because when we don't want to feel our emotions, we can't feel our body, because our emotions exist in our body. So when we disconnect from the physical, then we can disconnect from the emotions as well. And a lot of times people will be so disconnected from their body that they don't even know their gut is off, because they just don't want to feel anything.
Diving into the world of emotional health can be huge, and we're going to dedicate an entire episode on this later in the series. Let's move back to stress and look at what we can actually do about it. Here's Summer Bock again.
Simple things like your house being disorganized. I mean, that sounds so simplistic, but one of the things I tell people if they're unhealthy and they're stressed, clean your house. Figure out a way to get your house organized. If you have piles of clutter everywhere, you're telling your mind, like, it's not finished. There's something I have to do. It's not okay to relax. Like, I have to finish that. I have to do this. It's creating more to-do lists. So clean up your house, create beauty and order around you so you can relax and enjoy the space. Finances have to be figured out. And I know that's a biggie. And so many people are like, well, that's not going to happen right now. Sure, that might be like 10,000 decisions from now or 1 million decisions from now, but you still have to start making those decisions now so that you can architect the future that you want for yourself. I think it's worth investing our own time in learning how to have peaceful relationships and what that means. And that means having a peaceful relationship with ourselves. It means understanding ourselves. It means asking for what we need and being in relationships where we do get what we need, and getting out of relationships gracefully where we don't get what we need. And I mean, I could spend a lot of time on this subject because I do think that this is a place where most people are messing up. People don't put a lot of attention. They just kind of keep doing the status quo, like this is what it's supposed to be day to day. They don't question it a lot. They just think this, maybe they were raised a certain way, or they see what other people are doing and that's just what it's supposed to be. But I would just encourage people to raise their standards in every area of these parts of their lives so that they can have the health that they deserve.
Some great advice here from Summer Bock. I think the very first thing we need to do to address stress is acknowledge just how much we have to begin with. What I can tell you from working with thousands of patients with gut problems is that if you have gut symptoms, you also have stress. So ask yourself, how am I existing day to day? What fills up my day? Are you just constantly busy, or do you have space to actually relax and rejuvenate? A lot of the time, the stress that we have in our life is actually caused by us. We're the ones that put these things in place. We stay at the job that we hate, or with the bad partner, or say yes to everything, or fill our time with social media, or whatever it is for you. To change this, we have to take responsibility for where we're at, and then take action to shift our lives in a positive direction. We're going to move on from stress into other areas of gut-brain. But before I do, I wanted to ask Dr. Leo Galland. As an integrative doctor and the author of many books, Dr. Leo is one of the most respected doctors when it comes to the microbiome.
Gut microbes have receptors for neurotransmitters and for hormones. There's some fascinating research looking at norepinephrine and gut microbes. Among the bacteria that are the major human pathogens, E. coli, Klebsiella, Proteus, and a lot of really severe infections are caused by organisms like that. And they also tend to stimulate very brisk inflammatory responses. They are very sensitive to norepinephrine, and they really like it, and they grow faster, and they express virulence factors to a greater extent when they're in an environment that's enriched with levels of norepinephrine that are physiologic for humans. That is, these are not huge levels. They're what a stressed person would have in his or her tissues. So the observation that stress increases the risk of infection, for many years I've thought about it, and I think most physicians have, is, well, stress suppresses your immune system, and that's why you're more susceptible to these infections. But it's not only you that's being affected, it's the microbes that are being affected. They like the noradrenaline, they like the stress. And not only do they infect you, they stimulate inflammation, which generates more stress. And that makes sense from the microbes' perspective. You thrive in a stressful environment. Yeah, you want that stressful environment.
So it's like a vicious cycle in a way.
Yes, it is. It is. And that's why paying attention to what people think and the way they think and trying to calm the stress that so many of us experience, especially when we're sick, is really important for healing.
How we feel colours our days. If we're emotional, anxious, low, or have low self-esteem, it severely impacts on our lives. In Season 2 of The Shift, we'll explore our minds, the neurochemistry, the biology, the emotions, and the subconscious. You don't want to miss this, so be sure to subscribe so that you know when it drops.
The Shift!
There's a mounting pile of research that links gut health to mood issues like depression and anxiety. Jodie is a 23-year-old woman with quite the significant health history for somebody her age. Jodie had her initial naturopathic appointment with me a couple of years ago, but then she was under the care of the rest of my team. It wasn't until I interviewed her that I realised just how far she had come. Her story is remarkable, and it really highlights the link between gut, emotions, and brain health.
Very up and down, so really happy one minute, really sad the next. But the sad moments were more so than the happy moments, so majority of the time I felt quite flat. Very unmotivated, didn't want to do anything. Hopelessness, despair, that kind of thing. Didn't want to engage, wanted to just disconnect from people. And lots of tears, I was really teary. And yeah, just so flat and sad and hopeless. Like, I can't even explain it. And to look back now, it makes me so sad because I'm like, oh, you poor little girl. Like, I wish I could have helped you more. Yeah, so 16, 17, I got diagnosed with depression at that point, actually. And I was put on antidepressants when I was 16.
Now, Jodie also has a significant amount of gastrointestinal symptoms, which is why I interviewed her for The Shift. Let's take a look at how Jodie's gut symptoms might have been a contributing factor to the development of her depression at such a young age. Dr. Vincent Pedre was the perfect person to ask.
The microbiome produces a whole bunch of very important byproducts of their metabolism. Among them are neurotransmitters like GABA, which is inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it helps you feel calm. So when they've done studies feeding women kefir daily and then measuring their anxiety scores, they did one study where they did this for, I think, like a 2 to 4 week period, and they found that anxiety scores lowered by just having 8 ounces of kefir every day. So we know that there's this interaction with our bodies and our brain with the microbiome. But the other thing that they produce, which is key and so important, are short-chain fatty acids. And those are the metabolic byproducts of fiber that gets consumed by the microbiomes. Fibers are just undigestible starches. They're oligosaccharides that we can't break down. So short-chain sugars that we don't have the enzymes to break down, but the bacteria, they do. They can use it for energy, and they produce these short-chain fatty acids that are used by the cells that line the colon as energy, for example, butyrate. But butyrate also has a whole bunch of modulatory effects throughout the body, including regulating blood sugar, insulin sensitivity, and neuroplasticity, so helping your brain form memory. is connected to the microbiome, which is connected to your diet and your intake of fiber in the diet.
The fact that our bacteria make neurotransmitters is quite new, but your gut actually produces over 80% of your serotonin, a neurotransmitter that was thought to be only isolated in the brain, where it helps promote feelings of happiness. Dr. Vincent also mentioned GABA, a calming neurotransmitter which, when deficient, can lead to increases in anxiety and tension. Dr. David Perlmutter is a leading integrative neurologist and the author of 4 books, including Grain Brain and Brain Maker. I could not have a conversation about gut and brain health without hearing what he had to say. Here, he talks about the link between the gut and moods.
We're now beginning to see that gut bacterial changes are related to depression and correlate quite well with levels of inflammatory markers in the blood that are measurable. So we're beginning to connect those downstream dots that show that when the gut bacteria is disrupted, ultimately it leads to increased inflammation, which, oddly enough, seems to be a cornerstone player in creating depression. We know that when there are higher levels of inflammatory markers in the blood, it changes and reduces the availability of the neurotransmitter serotonin through what's called the kynurenic acid pathway. So higher levels of inflammation reduce the availability of the happy chemical serotonin.
That's really profound.
Dr. Emran Mayer at the University of California, Los Angeles, has actually written a book on this, and he actually performed a very interesting study where he gave a yogurt enriched with probiotics to a group of women and measured brain activity when they were challenged with images that were somewhat disquieting, compared to another part of the group who got the yogurt that didn't have bacteria in it, and compared to another group of women who did not get any yogurt, and found that the group receiving the bacteria-enriched yogurt demonstrated dramatic changes on functional MRI scanning. In other words, the activity in their brains when they were confronted by these photographs that were a little bit disquieting was different in comparison to those who didn't get the bacteria. And that research didn't get a lot of play, but I think it's profound. We're now beginning to see that gut bacterial changes are related to depression and correlate quite well with levels of inflammatory markers in the blood that are measurable. So we're beginning to connect those downstream dots that show that when the gut bacteria is disrupted, ultimately it leads to increased inflammation, which, oddly enough, seems to be a cornerstone player in creating depression. We know that when there are higher levels of inflammatory markers in the blood, it changes and reduces the availability of the neurotransmitter serotonin through what's called the kynurenic acid pathway. So higher levels of inflammation reduce the availability of the happy chemical serotonin.
I think the biggest thing that I discovered was the link between gut health and mental health for me. And I now realise that it's so linked, it's so intertwined, how our mental health is and how our gut health is, and then physically how we manifest that as well.
That was Jodie again, and she's not alone. There are so many people out there with this link of gut and mental health problems. Lee Holmes is the author of 9 healthy eating cookbooks and a passionate health advocate. I asked her what she thought the biggest issue people were facing today.
Mental health is probably one of the biggest issues at the moment, and I think it's going to become more and more prevalent. But it's good that it's being talked about more these days, but I think that's a big issue for a lot of people.
It's interesting with the gut-brain connection, how they're both concurrently kind of getting in the spotlight, which is really good.
Yeah. Actually, Dr. Emran Mayer, he's amazing, and he's the guy that wrote the Mind-Gut Connection book. He says that our bacteria actually communicate with each other without us even being involved in it, which is really interesting. And for every one message our brain sends to our gut sends 10 back up. So what's really in charge of our thoughts and feelings and mood, when you think about the serotonin being manufactured in the gut, a lot of it, then obviously your gut and the balance of everything, the ecosystem of your gut is going to affect your mood.
Some of the concepts we explore on this program will take 17 years to make it into your doctor's office. The change needs to come from us, so I ask that you please share this knowledge. I don't care how you do it, a text, an email, a private Facebook message, or showing a friend over coffee. Let's get this information out there.
The shift! We always kind of knew that there was a relationship between the gut and mental health, but it's now started to be understood that the signalling that goes on via the probiotics at the gut wall is so sophisticated. It can mean that the probiotics actually travel. It can mean that they signal through neurotransmitters. A lot of these mechanisms are still kind of in their infancy and understanding, but we have the same types of neurotransmitters on the gut wall as we do in the brain. But around 95% of serotonin is actually on the gut wall. And a lot of that it's about motility in the gut, how the gut moves food through. But we're also realizing that a lot of that is about processing back up to the brain. It doesn't travel from the gut to the brain, it doesn't move through the gut-brain barrier, but it does signal by the central nervous system. And it's very interesting. So when people take SSRIs, which a lot of people are on, those antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which increase circulating serotonin in the brain, they will have symptoms that are called side effects that are digestive symptoms. It makes sense that if you affect serotonin on any part of the nervous system, it's going to have some effect in the gut.
That was UK nutritionist Charlotte Watts again. I also wanted to know what Dr. Vincent Pedre had to say on this topic.
So important, and that is tied to a multitude of things. We know that bacteria have a pathway called the shikimate pathway. That pathway produces 3 very important aromatic amino acids. 2 of them are used to make neurotransmitters. So tyrosine, which is a product from that pathway, is used to make dopamine. And dopamine is kind of like the feel-good hormone. So it kind of makes things in life feel good. And then the other byproduct is tryptophan, which is the precursor for serotonin, which is the happy neurotransmitter. It makes you feel happy. The last one is phenylalanine, but that one is not as important in terms of brain health. So we know that the majority of serotonin in the body is actually coming from the gut, not from the brain.
We all have a story, a history of events that have gotten us to the current state of health that we're in right now. You might remember Jodie mentioning that she was diagnosed with depression and put on antidepressants at the age of 16. This kind of thing does not happen by chance, and I wanted to get a bit of backstory to see how Jodie might have gotten into such a difficult spot.
Mum started giving me formula, and at the time didn't know that I couldn't have like dairy formula. So she did soy here and there, but I had a lot of reflux when I was a kid. And we didn't really know what it was, so I actually went to a naturopath at that time, did some intolerance testing, and I was intolerant to dairy at that point. Came off dairy and symptoms went away, but being a 13-year-old girl wanting to have milkshakes with her friends, I kind of ignored it somewhat, and then symptoms came back really quite bad when I was then 15. So I went to a naturopath again, and I was also told that I was gluten intolerant at the time, so it was gluten and dairy. And I took it seriously that time because I cared more about how I looked, and it was actually really quite severe, like in terms of how my eyes would look when I'd wake up. They'd be so swollen, I'd be so itchy, and it was really irritable. So then I decided to do something about it. My symptoms in terms of physical things like rashes and the swollenness and that kind of thing definitely subsided. That was great. I had bad gut health. I didn't know I had that. My diet in some ways was highly acidic. There were foods that I should be eating less of and other foods that I should have been eating way more of. But yeah, if we look at my diet when the onset of, the depression and the mood issues were, it kind of does correlate when I was still dabbling in things that my body didn't like to enjoy. I think part of it was that I didn't want to acknowledge that what I had going on was actually an issue. So I was kind of trying to ignore it and hoping that it would go away. And I think also just a fear of the unknown.
While mood disorders can be caused by a number of factors, in Jodie's case, I can't help but wonder if her gut story had been different, how this would have changed her health trajectory. The gut-brain connection is one of the most amazing breakthroughs when we look at mental health because it opens up a whole new area of treatment. From a naturopathic perspective, we nearly always will treat the gut and nervous system concurrently. This means that as the gut heals, the brain benefits, and as the brain and nervous system calm down, the gut can function better. This is where treating the whole of you, not just parts in isolation, can really make the world of difference in your healing journey. Neuro inflammation means that your brain is inflamed. Inflammation can lead to disease and other issues, as we'll discover, so neuroinflammation is very bad news for your body. There's probably nobody better to talk to about neuroinflammation than integrative neurologist Dr. David Perlmutter. David has worked with thousands of patients with degenerative brain disease and other neurological disorders, and is one of few neurologists that integrates diet with conventional medical treatment.
The gut is actually where the set point for inflammation in the body is determined. We need to maintain the integrity of the gut lining so that certain proteins, certain bacterial products, certain components of bacteria don't make their way across that gut lining to then challenge the immune system and turn on inflammation. One of the most pervasive chemicals, certainly the most well-studied, is something called LPS, which means lipopolysaccharide. And lipopolysaccharide is the covering over a large group of bacteria. When there's permeability or the gates are opened in the lining, this lipopolysaccharide can make its way across the gut lining, challenge the immune system, and absolutely amp up inflammation. About the worst thing that could happen.
And what's the result of that in the body?
So the downstream damage done by inflammation and these inflammatory chemicals, things like interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, is that they ultimately compromise the functionality of the mitochondria, and as such, lead to increased production of damaging chemicals called free radicals. And it's these free radicals that damage things like our DNA, protein, and fat. So that then connects our lifestyle choices through the lens of what's going on in the gut to increased free radical activity, damaging of our tissues, and degeneration of the human body.
We've mentioned leaky gut or intestinal permeability a few times. What Dr. David is saying is that when we have a leaky gut, it can cause inflammation in our brains. Dr. Tom is a functional medicine doctor and the author of the book You Can Fix Your Brain. I asked him, what does it mean to have a leaky brain?
The technical term is a breach of the blood-brain barrier, and the components of the blood-brain barrier are the same and similar to all of the components of the intestinal barrier. You get a leaky gut, you get a leaky brain. When you get one of the more common tests used today to identify a leaky gut, pathogenic intestinal permeability, is antibodies to the zonulin family of proteins and antibodies to actin and myosin. Well, the zonulin family of proteins and actin and myosin are components of the blood-brain barrier. So when you do a blood test and you're looking for antibodies to identify pathogenic intestinal permeability, the antibodies are in your blood. You aren't checking the gut, you're checking the blood to see if the antibodies are there that cause the gut problem. Well, if they're in the blood, they go everywhere. They don't just go to the gut, they go everywhere in your body, which means they go to the brain. They go past the brain, they go past the kidneys. You get a leaky gut, you got a leaky bladder, you got a leaky kidney, you got a leaky brain. Just depending on your genetic vulnerability, where's it manifesting? A test came out that looks at a breach of the blood-brain barrier, and it looks at 18 different markers of brain inflammation. It's called the brain Zoomer, and there's never been a test like this before. 97 to 99% sensitivity, 98 to 100% specificity on identifying, do you have inflammation in your brain? Listen, here's the thing. Everybody knows someone that had a heart attack and survived, changed their diet, started exercising, now they look better than they felt in years. Most of us know someone diagnosed with cancer. They went through protocols, it's in remission, they're doing great. Nobody knows anyone diagnosed with a brain deterioration disease that's doing great. It terrifies us, and we don't know what to do about it. It's no different than any other symptom. You just have to go back upstream and figure out what's going on. So the neural zoomer tells you, you got inflammation in your brain right now. Right now. It doesn't tell you why. It says, this is what's going on. Well, I feel fine. Really? Didn't you say you walk in the room and sometimes you forget why you walked in the room? Or where are my keys? Or I'm just not remembering names the way I used to. Yeah, but I'm getting older. How old are you? I'm 42. No, that's not supposed to happen. You're supposed to be able to learn new languages in your 80s. But your brain is going down. And it scares the heck out of us because we don't know what to do. You can fix your brain. And so the first thing people have to realize, doctors need to realize, because we've never been told this before, is how common a breach of the blood-brain barrier is. And that's what the neural zoomer is for, so you can identify not only that you've got inflammation in the brain, but you've got a breach of the blood-brain barrier.
A great explanation there from Dr. Tom O'Brien. Again, Dr. Tom talks to us about going upstream, finding out what the cause of the issue is. I asked Dr. David Perlmutter what some of the drivers of neuroinflammation were.
Well, interestingly, we spoke earlier about the leakiness of the gut barrier and how that allows certain chemicals, these pro-inflammatory mediators or cytokines, to then enter the systemic circulation and affect the entire body, including the brain. We understand that the brain is somewhat protected from various toxins, if you will, by what is called the blood-brain barrier. And it turns out, interestingly, that many of the factors that increase the permeability of the gut lining similarly increase the permeability of this network called the blood-brain barrier that protects the brain. So, sure, it's bad to have a leaky gut, but having a leaky brain is not necessarily a party either. So now we have a situation where damaging chemicals can make their way through the gut lining and ultimately into the brain. And it is there that inflammation is really quite fundamentally damaging to not just the cells themselves, but their functionality. And therein lies the connection then between the gut and brain degeneration that is getting a lot of play, a lot of research as of late.
One of the symptoms that a lot of our clients get is memory loss, like not remembering things as much, having to keep lists, like not remembering people's names, or even, that lack of brain function where it takes them a moment to recall things. What does that mean when that's happening?
Can you repeat the question? No, I'm kidding. That was a joke. All right.
That was a good one.
So the colloquialism is senior moments. It was taken that, as you get older, you're going to begin to have more and more of these events. They are not trivial. They are indicators for trouble to come. They're harbingers for trouble down the line. So we cannot casually explain them away and saying, it's just part of getting older. It is profoundly important that this type of complaint be recognized for what it is and be addressed. As it relates to Alzheimer's disease, we now recognize that the changes that are happening are taking place 30 years ahead of time. A couple of studies, I'll quote one from 2008, looked at the size of the belly, the abdominal girth, and studied individuals for 36 years based upon that original measurement. How big was your belly? 36 years later, there was a dramatic increased risk for both shrinkage of the brain and poorer memory function in those people who 36 years before simply had a bigger belly. Another study looked at inflammatory markers and determined that those individuals who had inflammatory markers 24 years ago had a dramatic increased risk for brain issues today. So the point is that those issues that affect the brain, both of which, big belly and inflammatory markers, center on the mechanism of inflammation, those seeds that are sown in our 20s and 30s begin to sprout when we are in our 50s and 60s, long before we have our senior moments.
And I think too, when you hear all these things, it can be a bit doom and gloom, but the silver lining is that the solutions aren't that complicated. And if people can really get it and understand it and want to make the change, then they can prevent a lot of these things from happening.
It is doom and gloom, though. If you do nothing, it is doom and gloomy. And it's the thing people fear the most. It's not cancer. It's losing your cognitive abilities to the extent that people have to care for you in every possible way, including your personal hygiene and feeding you. That's the burden that people don't want to put on others. And yet, that's what's affecting 40 million people globally. That number will triple by 2050.
There was so much amazing information in this episode, so let's recap what we know about the gut-brain connection. Your gut is intrinsically connected to your brain. When you're stressed, it impairs the digestive process and changes your microbiome. When your microbiome is compromised, it then affects your ability to cope with stress. Most of your neurotransmitters are produced by microbes in your gut. This means that disruptions in the gut flora can lead to deficiencies in neurotransmitters with resulting anxiety, depression, or mood alterations. When you have a leaky gut, you have a leaky brain. This breach of the blood-brain barrier leads to neuro inflammation. Neuro inflammation is bad news for your brain and is a cause of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia. Neuroinflammation has also been linked to anxiety, depression, and other mood disorders. To heal your gut, you need to work on stress. A state of calm is essential if we are to digest and absorb our food properly. We're going to expand on this even more in the Expert series, so be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. I hope by now that you're really understanding just how vital this thing we call our gut is for the health of the entire body. In the next episode, we're going to look at how our gut is linked to the steady increase in chronic disease across the globe and what we can do about it.
Coming up on The Shift.
You take the meds so you feel better, you can function, but then you have to identify, why is my body inflamed?
Women have very different immune systems.
I have to say one of my bones to pick with what we have called chronic diseases or non-communicable diseases is that we don't cure them.
I think I was in hospital 40 times in those 5 to 6 years.
They're living longer, but they're living sicker, and I think that's a real important issue.
I hope you're loving the information in The Shift as much as I do. But maybe you're thinking, what do I need to do for me? Take our online assessment to discover what your gut is up to. Go to theshiftclinic.com/quiz.
The Shift!
This series is produced by Must Amplify. Hosted by Katherine Maslen. Executive producer Ronsley Vaz. Music and sound design by Shade Furlong. Thank you to all of our experts. For more details on them, go to theshiftclinic.com/gut.
Still listening? Reviews help us know that we're hitting the mark with what you need and help us to shape future seasons. I'd really appreciate it if you could take a few moments to leave us a review. I would love to know what you think.
The Shift!
Thank you for listening.
Every listen or download of this show
and hence this voice
directly funds the ending of sex
and human trafficking.
A voice for a voice.
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 Find out more at
amplifyimpacts.com.